Hello everybody, my name is Steven Zablosky, and today I'll be discussing amphetamine, more commonly known as Adderall, in relation to treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. To start with a little background information, amphetamine was first discovered in 1910 as a race mixture known as alpha-methylphenolphthaleamine, but it wasn't synthesized until 1927 for use to act as a substitute for a drug known as ephedrine, which was a stimulant used to treat low blood pressure under anesthesia. For a long time after this, it was used in treatment of narcolepsy, but currently we know amphetamine to be used in the treatment of ADHD. Currently, the most common FDA-approved variant of amphetamine is dextroamphetamine, which is a synthetic drug that we all know as Adderall. For the purposes of this presentation, however, I will refer to Adderall generally as amphetamine. But how does amphetamine work, and what neurotransmitters are affected by this? Well, amphetamine affects presynaptic cells in three main mechanisms that are displayed in this figure. When amphetamine is administered, typically through oral methods, it enters the presynaptic axon terminal through diffusion, or DAT, which we know to be dopamine transporters. Once inside the cell, there are three main effects. First, we may see inhibition of vesicular bodies that are specific toward monoamine neurotransmitters like dopamine or serotonin. And these vesicular bodies are known as VMATs, which you can see in the figure as well. This inhibition causes increased dopamine in the cytosol, allowing for more dopamine to be released into the cleft for action on the postsynaptic cell. The second mechanism comes from amphetamine inhibition of monoamine oxidase, or MAO, and we actually spoke about MAO in class as the enzyme that is breaking down dopamine. This is essentially increasing the amount of dopamine that is available for activity, as MAO is unable to break down any of the excess dopamine within the cytosol. The final mechanism involves the binding of amphetamine to an intracellular receptor known as trace amine associated receptor, or TAAR. This starts the process of internalization of dopamine transporters, causing an increase in the amount of dopamine that remains in the synaptic cleft due to there isn't an ability for reuptake to occur. So in summary, we are mainly affecting neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, and even others like norepinephrine as well, which is extremely important to this process, but we won't talk about it today. But what does this drug really do, as in what behavioral effects are we seeing with its administration? Well, based on what we just talked about with its mechanism of action, the most important effect was to dopamine, resulting in higher rates of it across the board. This means that we're tapping into the mesolimbic system of our brains. This also means that there's a significant potential for addiction through overaction or overactivation of the nucleus accumbens. And abuse of amphetamine is also associated with tolerance and psychological dependence, which generally produces withdrawal symptoms like fatigue, depression, and social disabilities. And this would be due to the dysregulation of dopamine returning, and possibly even worse than before the use of amphetamine. Furthermore, this tolerance is formed in a similar way to nicotine, where building excess of dopamine would be followed by downregulation of those dopaminergic receptors. However, it's not all bad. For most, it's going to increase their energy, elevate mood, increase attention, suppress their appetite, improve motivation, and even cause effective mood changes like reduced social inhibition. Physiologically, it may even raise heart rate or blood pressure, and it can cause restlessness. And I know what you're all thinking. If those are the effects of amphetamine, then why is it being prescribed to those with ADHD? Well, surprisingly enough, ADHD is actually just associated with a dysregulation of dopamine, typically causing deficit to dopaminergic activity. Therefore, by modulating the regulation of dopamine using amphetamine, as we had shown in the previous slides, we can treat the symptoms of ADHD, and there's actually been studies completed showing that amphetamine can cause increases to the amount of physical effort that those with ADHD can exert as well. Although, interestingly enough, in the same study, they found there's little to no effect to cognitive performance with those taking amphetamine with ADHD. As you can see in the figure with the two blue lines, they're almost identical to one another. But what other factors are involved here? Well, because amphetamines are typically administered as a pill, there is typically some first-pass metabolism which occurs in the liver. More specifically, amphetamines undergo extensive hepatic metabolism, largely by the hepatic P450 system, through the CYP2D6 enzyme, whose protein structure you can see here in this image, which was found in the protein database. Regardless of all that, we also see that amphetamine has relatively low depot binding, with only about 16 to 20% of amphetamine being bound to plasma proteins after absorption in the intestines. With all this considered, we are also seeing first order kinetics in amphetamine metabolism with a half-life of approximately 9 to 11 hours, as you can see in this figure here, of methamphetamine metabolism. And it's fair to use a figure for methamphetamine metabolism, as you can hear in methamphetamine, it's a part of the same family as amphetamine, and it's actually occasionally used in the treatment of ADHD in some cases, although with a much lower dose. Finally, we're going to be seeing, after metabolism, elimination occurring in the kidneys, where pH-dependent excretion can occur, with amphetamine being seen at rates of 1 to even as high as 75%, depending on many factors, including pH and water consumption and all that. But other than that, thank you so much, guys. And here are my references.